Alright, so I'm going to talk about the balance patch that occurred earlier this week, or I guess I should say the mini balance patch that occurred earlier this week. Since, as the devs made quite clear, it is not their major quarterly balance patch, it's just a mini one that they threw in to take care of issues, primarily issues with condition classes. Now, before I talk about that, I'm going to apologize for how late this video is. I originally meant to make this on Tuesday when the patch came out. Unfortunately, I have had a whole slew of things occur both in real life and also tech issues that have kind of prevented me from making videos. The worst of which is on Tuesday, the drive that I record all my videos to actually became corrupted. It had a CRC error, which means the drive is basically dead and I lost all of the data in that drive. Which, you know, kind of threw me back because I've had to remake all of my thumbnails and splash images and stuff. And then I also have apparently developed a issue with my monitor this week on Wednesday, where I have it like, you can't see it in the video because this video is rendering from the GPU, but what I see on my monitor is like half the frame rate of what y'all are seeing in the video. But it's weird because it's not like a frame rate loss, it's just like some of the frames aren't there, if that makes any sense. So like, my ability input and skill inputs are fine. It's just what I see on my screen is like 10 frames per second constant, which makes playing PvP a bit awkward. I mean, it's not, since I'm not losing input, I can still wreck people. It just makes seeing things really hard, and it's also makes me kind of nauseous after a while playing at that low of a frame rate. And I've been trying to fix those issues this week, so that's been kind of crazy. I have a feeling I'm probably going to end up having to get a new rig. Because at first I thought I was just having a monitor issue, but then I plugged in a different monitor that I knew was fine, and it had the same issue, so it looks like my rig itself is having some sort of an issue. And given that my computer is a laptop, you can't exactly fix laptops very well, so I'm probably just going to have to get a desktop, or build my own at least. But anyways, moving on to the patch. So the patch itself was fairly straightforward. They took every single Condi class in the game except for Mirage, and I'll talk about why Mirage was excluded from this later, and took how many stacks they would apply on various skills and reduced the amount of stacks applied, but then increased duration. And the reasoning for this was simple. It's they wanted to make conditions more of a damage over time effect rather than this bursty Condi application that a lot of the specs in PvP have been doing. Which I agree with. I understand why they did it, and it made sense. And they applied it, for the most part, fairly well. There were a few things that were excluded. For example, on Scourge, which is probably the class that people were the most interested in getting its Condi application nerfed, they apply less Condis on F5 now. You'll notice it's only pulsing 1 torment instead of 2 torments for pulse. Corruption skills as well. They only corrupt into 1 torment instead of corrupting boons into... or punishment skills, not corruption skills. Punishment skills only create 1 torment when they convert a boon rather than 2 torment, which is definitely an improvement. And the biggest change of all is probably in Torch, where Harrowing Wave, it only applies 2 torment and 1 burning now for longer durations, rather than before where it applied 3 burning and 3 torment up front, which was pretty crazy, particularly for a baseline weapon skill effect. So overall, Scourge is less bursty, it is doing a bit more over time damage. It is still absolutely dominant in the meta. This patch, while it definitely toned down how effective Scourge is, did not remove it from the meta and did not take Scourge out of its meta-defining role. But it is certainly noticeable how different it is. I can say with certainty that I can definitely notice a difference when fighting Scourges. And this is kind of true for all Condi classes, because again, this was applied to all Condi classes except for Mirage. Anyways, I'm not going to go into too much about what happened to the other classes outside of Scourge. They didn't nerf anything else on Scourge other than the aforementioned changes to stack durations. However, one change that did heavily affect Scourge and affected some other classes is they changed barriers. So what they did is they took all of the barriers in the game, increased their size by 15%, and then changed how degeneration works. So barriers no longer degenerate. Instead, they just disappear after 3 seconds. So there's no more degeneration, it's there until its duration runs out, and then whatever's left just instantly disappears. Which means it's a lot easier to get a full value out of your barrier, so it's definitely a defensive increase for classes with barrier access, such as Scourge. It is important that Scourge did not actually receive the barrier buff, as far as I can tell. That appears to be a bug. It may also have been intentional, given how strong Scourge is. The patch notes didn't specify that that was intended, but all of the other barrier sources in the game were increased by 15%, but Scourge's was not, although Scourge did benefit from the change to barrier degeneration, which is pretty noticeable in their defenses. Another thing about this patch that increased Scourge's defenses is because they reduced the duration, or they reduced the stack count of Condis applied by Scourge and increased the duration of Condis applied by Scourge. It means that running Condi duration is no longer very important for Scourge. So previously, Scourges would primarily run Deadshot Amulet. That was the most common pick for Scourges, because it gave them longer Condi durations, which was useful for them in PvP before, because most of their durations were high stack count with very low duration. So that extra expertise was really beneficial to them, but with the extremely long conditions they're applying now at low stacks, they don't really care about Condi duration anymore, because their durations are long enough now that their target's either going to die or cleanse it long before it expires. So expertise is no longer valuable, which means that any Scourge that knows what they're doing is going to be switching to Carrion, which means more vitality, which means both a little bit better base health, which is a little bit better defense, and also means they have easier resource management. Also, Carrion means they'll be doing slightly more damage per stack, even though they'll be applying less stacks. So again, Scourge is didn't really get hit all that hard once you account for all the changes. Moving on, again, like I said earlier, all the other classes were applied the Condi changes. Given that there weren't really any other Condi builds in the meta, though, that didn't mean much for the overall meta. Some miscellaneous changes, because this patch did not just include the overall changes to Condi, but included some other changes. Reaper had some buffs to Axe. So Axe, basically what they did is they got rid of the Axe trait, which used to be right here, and what the Axe trait used to do is it used to make Axe skills deal 10% extra damage to foes affected by vulnerability, and it also reduced their cooldown by 20%. The cooldown reduction got rolled into Spiteful Talisman, so Spiteful Talisman is now reducing the cooldown of Axe and Focus skills instead of just Focus skills. They then got rid of the whole damage bonus and just basically rolled that into the 3 Axe skills. So all 3 of the Axe skills got a damage bonus to each of them, which was nice, particularly since most PvP builds didn't even run the Axe trait, which meant it was effectively just a free damage buff for Axe. The new trait that they've replaced the Axe trait with is called Dread. It's just damage bonus on feared foes, and fearing a foe now implies vulnerability. This trait's not very useful. I've seen some people trying to make this trait useful for some build or whatever. It's not. The only really beneficial thing this does is the vulnerability, because we just don't have the fear durations to make much use of the damage bonus, and a 20% damage bonus just isn't that much to write home about anyways. At least, or rather a 20% damage bonus on such a limited condition isn't that much. Because, I mean, Terrifying, it's a 1-second duration. Staff Mark is also a 1-second duration, and so forth. You just don't have the fear durations unless you go to stack for it, and if you're just trying to stack fear duration, you lose a lot of other things, so it's just not really effective. The only really beneficial part about this trait is the extra vulnerability. So maybe there's some interesting combination with like fearing a foe and then immediately using Ghastly Claws, which gets an extra damage bonus per stack of vulnerability on the foe. But again, that's just such a niche use for that. It's just not really beneficial, and Awaken the Pain and Chill of Death are both better traits offensively than Dread. Although, if you wanted to make a really funny troll build, you could just stack fear effects, because, you know, you get Chill on Fear from Reaper, you can get Torment on Fear from Curses, along with Fear actually dealing damage, and hey, you can get Vulnerability on Fear now. So you could, you know, troll with that, but that would not be an effective build. Don't actually build around that. It would just kind of be a joke troll build. That was kind of it for the Necromancer changes. Oh, about Spiteful Talisman. Since they did roll both Axe and Focus together in this, this could be useful now on very specific builds. I'm not really seeing it get used unless Focus gets a rework to be more useful. I guess I could maybe see it being used if, say, you're running a build with low might access, because if you have low might access, you run Chill of Death, because it's a better trait for builds with low might. And Spiteful Talisman does reduce the ICD on Chill of Death, so maybe if you're running an Axe and taking Chill of Death, it might be worth picking up Spiteful Talisman. It's still, even then, it's really just not that great of a pick unless Focus gets buffs that make it useful. So that's basically it for Reaper and Necro as a whole. It doesn't... The meta positions of both Reaper and Scourge were not really changed by this patch at all, but Scourge did get a tone down, and Reaper did get a slight buff. I do think the devs should be a little bit careful. Oh! I completely forgot. Death's Embrace was given a change. Death's Embrace used to be, it would give you an extra vulnerability on strike when hitting a foe below 33% health, which was really bad, because basically when a foe is below 33% health, they're either going to die in the next couple of seconds, or they're going to pop their disengage / defenses and get away in the next few seconds. And having extra vulnerability on a low health foe like that, it just doesn't really matter at all. So what they did is they took Death's Embrace, they moved its health threshold that it activates up to 50%, but then they changed it to, instead of 1 vulnerability on strike, it is 5 vulnerability on strike on a 10-second interval. So it's a little bit, you basically, when you hit 50%, you get this little tiny burst of vulnerability generation, which is actually kind of nice. I mean, it's less overall vulnerability application than the older version of the trait, but since the older version of the trait was so constrained due to only applying to foes below 33% health, the fact that they moved the health threshold up makes it better, in my opinion. So this trait's definitely improved. But again, it's not a huge thing. This isn't like a game-changing trait change or anything, but it is an improvement over how the trait used to work. Because basically before, the only thing the trait was really useful for was the 25% damage boost when downed. Overall, again, Reaper did get damage buffs to Axe, and of course Death's Embrace change. Not really changing Reaper's position. I'm getting a little concerned at how many damage buffs they've been throwing at Reaper in the past 2 patches, because basically Reaper hits insanely hard now. Like, you basically delete people from existence with Shroud, and of course Axe is actually starting to hurt really hard now too. And I'm getting very concerned that if they keep buffing it like this, we're going to reach the point where if Scourge ever gets nerfed, Reaper's basically just going to take over Scourge as the why would you play anything else class. Because again, like, it hits so hard. Like, the only reason Reaper is bad right now is because of Scourge. If Scourge goes away, so at some point in the future Scourge will get nerfed out of the meta, presumably, and when that happens, Reaper will instantly become meta. And I'm getting a little concerned that they keep throwing more and more damage at Reaper, because it's getting a bit ridiculous. I mean, when I'm hitting 5-digit soul spirals running a paladin's build, that's kind of insane. Yeah, we're definitely not a good 1v1 class, and we definitely don't have, you know, the disengage or escapes that other classes do, but hey, why do you need those when you can just delete anything that gets near you from existence? But we'll see. Moving on to other classes, Ellie's didn't get much changes. They did get one change to a minor in their arcane tree, which is run on most Weaver builds. Basically, they get might when they swap attunements from arcane now instead of fury. The Ellie forum is whining about this because they consider it a nerf. I've actually been playing around with Weaver recently, and I don't actually think it's a nerf. I don't think it's a buff either. It's more of a horizontal change, because Weaver really did need some might stacking that wasn't dependent on blasting fields. And they kind of got that now. And the Fury, I think people are overestimating how useful it is. But again, the Fury is certainly was useful to Ellie, but I don't think it was more useful than the Might was. So that was kind of a horizontal change to Ellie. And they didn't really get anything else. And they were negatively affected by the Condi stack reduction, so Weaver's kind of in a worse place than it was before. Although the stack reductions did kind of help Tempest a bit, because Tempest support's always been a bit weak to Condi Bomb. So the lower stacks means Tempests aren't nearly as bad as they were, particularly in the Scourge meta. But again, they're still countered by Scourge even with the nerfs, so you're not going to be seeing too many of those. Other changes, Revs got a few things moved around, didn't really help them, didn't really change them much at all. Renegade got, ironically, affected by the stack nerf, so Renegade's even worse than it was, but I'm not really going to lose sleep raging about that because, I mean, Renegade was already bad. Their position in the meta hasn't changed, so what does it really matter? Because that's the thing, is people freak out so much about like counting how many nerfs and buffs their classes got. It doesn't matter how many nerfs or buffs your class gets. What matters is where your class is in the meta. So yeah, even if you get a change that isn't beneficial to your class, if it doesn't change where your class is in the meta, like, it's not hurting you. It may not be helping you, but it's not hurting you either. So Renegade, it was trash, it's still trash, it doesn't really matter. This patch didn't change anything. Herald really didn't get much. They changed kind of a little bit on their vulnerability application, didn't really do much. Moving on. Firebrand, they got a very controversial change. So basically, they took Merciful Intervention, which is a skill that Guardian has that causes them to teleport to an ally and heal them. They changed that skill to now give 20% downstate res, which when was implemented on Tuesday was insane, because that skill, while it is traditionally considered a terrible skill for Guardians and is never used on Core Guard and is never used on DH, it was used by Firebrand, so they basically just gave Support Firebrand a huge buff, and that instant 20% res on skill use was really insane, because if you go into downstate with no health penalty, you're at 75% down health, which means if you're downed and you have a support guardian, that guardian can instantly hit you with Merciful Intervention, and you're immediately at 95% downstate health just from that 20% downstate heal from Merciful, which means the guardian at that point just has to press F, and you're pretty much in upstate right there. Which basically meant that Firebrand could instant res with that change. That was kind of insane. Firebrand totally did not need that. The devs realized their mistake, and this past Thursday, they changed it. They nerfed it to it's a 5% res on skill use instead of a 20% res, and that's definitely a lot better. I mean, you can definitely argue that any kind of res buff for Merciful wasn't needed since it was a meta pick for Firebrand. But, I mean, I can kind of understand why they would buff it, since the trait was basically never used up until very, very recently with Firebrand. Because it's such a niche trait. Or niche skill, not trait. I keep saying trait. They also did some, this past Thursday, they kind of responded to all the complaints about Firebrand and threw in an extra change along with the Merciful nerf, or re-nerf, I guess. This was not in the Tuesday balance patch, this was the Thursday hotfix change to Firebrand that they did this. They changed their Mantra of Lore, which is a utility mantra that cleanses conditions on use. They changed it so the first 2 charges only cleanse 1 condition now, which I think is down from 2. But then they changed it so the final charge now converts 5 boons, or 5 conditions into boons instead of 2. Which I actually agree with this change, and I really like this change, because what it does is by reducing the Condi cleanse of the first 2 hits of the mantra, but then dramatically increasing the power of the last charge of the mantra, it incentivizes Firebrands to actually blow all of the charges of their mantra. Because one of the issues with Firebrand is mantras charges, once the mantra is charged, they can use that mantra instantly. And they won't have to cast it again unless they use all the charges. So the way you would play a Firebrand is you would only use the first 2 charges of any given mantra, and you would never use the last charge, which meant you would never have to recharge the mantra, which meant you just have these instant skills all the time. And that was a huge problem, because, well, they're instant, you can't do anything. Like, even if you stun them, they can still use that skill, and they can still use that mantra while they're rezzing someone or channeling a buff on Temple or whatever, and that was ridiculous. So, by moving a lot of the power into the last charge, it incentivizes Firebrands to use all of their charges. And of course, if they use all of their charges, they then have to recharge the mantra to use it again, and that is a long task that they would have to get off. So that's definitely a good change in terms of risk-reward. Now, there wasn't really any other changes. We're to Firebrand of note. Firebrand, they're still a crazy support even with these changes. Still meta-defying. The meta more or less hasn't changed, as I've mentioned before. The only other significant changes, if I recall correctly, was there was some changes done to Warrior's strength line. So basically, they used to have a minor where when they dodged, they'd get a damage bonus as long as their endurance was not full. So whenever their endurance was below 100%, like this, they get a 10% damage bonus. That was changed to where they get might. I think it's might when doing stuff. Now, which is... Or no, sorry. I'm getting my stuff mixed up. So, basically, 2 of the minors in strength were mixed up. The first minor, so the adept minor, was changed to reckless dodge is now a separate skill, because basically before warriors they dodge, it deals damage. That's now a skill in its own right, which doesn't really mean anything in terms of effectiveness. It just increases clarity on your combat log. But they also changed it to where they'll get might when they dodge roll, so they kind of buff that trait. They then changed the second minor, which was the minor that, as I mentioned before, gave them damage bonus when their endurance was not full. They changed that minor to where might on a warrior now gives extra 10 power. Basically, they gave warriors Awaken the Pain as a minor trait. That's basically what they did, minus the extra might generation. Now, that is a overall damage nerf, because a 10% flat damage boost is generally better than the might gain, because, you know, in PvP, you're probably not going to have full endurance all that often, so it's kind of a free damage that they got all the time. So that's a little bit of damage nerf there. I do support that change, and I kind of understand why it happened too, because while, yeah, that was kind of a nerf to strength, which isn't the meta pick for warrior in PvP, in PvE, strength is always used on power warrior, and one of the issues in PvE is the whole mechanic of you need to use endurance to get this damage bonus. That's just really clunky to use. Like, I remember back when you would actually use power warrior in raids, like way back in like 2015 and 2016. I actually played a power PS warrior, and I can tell you, just having dodge roll just to get a damage bonus was very, very annoying. So that is definitely a quality of life improvement for warriors, even if it is not necessarily a buff to warriors. The one other change they did is the Grandmaster called Might Makes Right in Strength, which what it did was when they gain Might, they get, it's like 100 and something healing, and they got 5 endurance. They nerfed it, they get 2 endurance instead. So they have way less endurance generation with that trait, which is kind of good because warrior was really dodge spammy with that trait. Like, they were basically as bad, if not worse, than Daredevils when it came to spamming dodges everywhere when they were running that trait before. Now, their might generation was slightly increased due to getting might on dodge roll now if they strike with reckless dodge when they dodge roll. So they do have a little bit more might generation. That does not offset the heavy endurance nerf to Might Make Right, but it does mean they get a little more healing out of Might Make Right now. So that's a little less active defense for warrior, a little more passive healing. It is a bit of a defensive nerf, but then again, Might Make Right was kind of insane before too. The warrior forum's still raging about that. Oh well. Thieves, I think, had a few changes. I don't think they were majors. I think they were mostly just Condi application changes. and none of the other classes really got changes. Mirage, I'm going to talk about Mirage now. I mentioned earlier that Mirage was not affected by the condition stack tone down that every other class was affected by. The devs actually did come out and explain the reasoning for this, and they explained it as Mirage is based on confusion. And they consider confusion to be a burst condition, meaning it's a condition designed to penalize you for using skills, but it's only supposed to penalize you for a small duration, but it's just supposed to penalize you very heavily. So they wanted it to be a burst condition. They wanted it to be short duration, extreme potency, and that's why they did not stack nerf Mirage and didn't give it the duration increase like they did with all the other Condi classes. And I'm going to say, while Mirage is an overpowered class right now and is the uncontested best 1v1 duelist in the game, no one can fight it, I do agree with their reasoning on why they excluded it, because if you think about it, confusion does penalize you for using skills. Now, if they changed it like they changed other classes, so they changed confusion to being low stacks with really long durations. I mean, if you've got this long duration but low stack confusion on your bar, you're not going to change your play pattern. You're not going to think, oh, maybe I shouldn't be activating skills. Because you're just going to be like, well, this is such a long duration, but it's such a low stack, I'll just keep spamming skills. You just would ignore it in such a case. So you want confusion to have these high stacks but short durations, because that actually makes the player think that maybe I shouldn't use a skill now. Because there's actually a heavy penalty there, but it's a penalty that wears off quickly. So I understand that basic reasoning. Now, the problem with Mirage, however, is Mirage just straight up applies way too much confusion way too frequently. The problem with Mirage is not a problem with confusion, it is a problem with Mirage just straight up being overpowered. This isn't any basic condition problem, and actually I'm going to extend that to Scourge. Scourge is the same way. Scourge's problem, while was slightly addressed with the stack changes, well, again, the problem with Scourge is not so much the stacks, it's just the entire way Scourge is designed. And same thing with Mirage. Both of those classes just need straight nerfs. Because basically Mirage, while yeah, the confusion durations are short compared to other conditions in the game, it can just apply confusion so rapidly with so many different things it just never falls off. So their burst condition ends up being a sustained and bursting condition, which again, they can just fix this by just nerfing Mirage's confusion access, not by just applying the Condi reworks that they applied to other classes. So while I would have liked to see more nerfs to Mirage, I do understand why they did not apply the stack nerf duration increase change like they did to other classes. Now granted, you could also make the same argument that you can make towards confusion about Torment, but I'm not going to mention that because the big offender in Torment right now is Scourge, which really does need to tone down. Again, overall, as I mentioned before, there's not really been any significant meta changes. There have been some slight shifts. Playing a Reaper is definitely a little bit better post-patch than it was before. Little more damage. Very glassy meta if you're not running with the support. Nothing really changed, but I will say I'm not going to complain about this balance patch. I've seen a lot of people complaining that this balance patch was horrible, it didn't do anything, blah blah blah. Yes, the balance patch did not change the meta, but it didn't hurt the meta. You know, Scourge did get a slight tone down. It's not, while Scourge is still dominant, it is not as dominant as it was before. So that is an improvement there. Once they reverted the Merciful Intervention change on Firebrand, Firebrand was not as crazy, and the change to Mantra of Lore on Firebrand is definitely beneficial to toning Firebrand down a bit, which it kind of needed. And then the general condition changes to all classes was beneficial. Like, it definitely was a good change to occur. It definitely did not change the meta, but it was still good. It is a step in the right direction. This was a beneficial patch. Hopefully, when the major patch comes in January, we'll actually see a significant change to the meta. But until then, the meta is still more or less what it is, just not nearly as insane. So, I'm definitely not going to complain about this patch. And I'll certainly keep playing, assuming my computer doesn't die from all the computer issues I've been having. If I'm not posting many videos, it's probably because my computer died and or I'm trying to build a new rig. And that's basically everything I wanted to talk about, and I'll end this video here.